In this session, I'd like to explore making some edits to the perspective view. So you can, of course, go and turn on perspective view and you get a little bit of perspective, but you can force that and exaggerate that using a camera and modifying that camera. So let's go to the display manager, which is there, and let's go to the third option down at the bottom, which is scene, lights and cameras. And by default, there's no camera set up, so let's set one up. Right click camera, add camera. And your screen will split. On the right hand side we get an approximation, or not an approximation, a preview rather, of the image we're about to get. So we're going to work in this left hand panel. What you can see is there's a camera floating in space. Now as you rotate around, that camera does not move, it stays locked to the model. So that just helps me get my orientation. So what you can do is you can pick up the blue handle there and drag that camera closer and further away from the model, and as you do that it changes over on the right hand side. You can change all different aspects here. You can move the camera left and right like that, or up and down. The important thing is this red dot in the center that you see there, that's the point that the camera is pointing at. So if you want, you can go target point, target by selection. Let's just say we want the camera to start pointing at this very, very front corner there, so click that. And now no matter how you move the camera, it'll move about that point and stay locked on, focused to that point. And it takes a bit of practice to actually get your bearings with rotating in space like this, but just give it a bit of time. And if you're still kind of finding it hard, rather than dragging this yellow sphere, just drag up and down, left and right, front and back. So let's just move that up a little bit, down a little bit, and there we have it. And what I'm going to do, excuse me, is drag this really close to the model, and I'm going to edit the camera. So you can see up here at the very top, let me find it here, show numeric controls. That just gives you a lot more options down here in the camera. And the first thing I want to do is change the angle of the camera, and I want to open that camera right the way up and then bring this blue arrow very, very close to the model itself. And that gives you this kind of much more realistic and much more forced perspective view. So let's just drag it a little bit closer again. I'm going to open up that angle even more. And as I open up the angle, I'm going to move the camera closer still, and then I'm just going to move this ever so slightly around like that. And you can always change things here, like you can change the length, and you can see the length is the overall focal length of the camera. So as I change that, bigger or smaller, it appears differently over here. And you can change the height, which is the opening of the top of the camera. So they're just minor little kind of adjustments. So you can either type in the value, you can drag this kind of rotate bar, or you can cycle them up and down like this. Down at the bottom you can change the aspect ratio and the type of camera. I'm happy enough with where it is. What I want to do is activate this depth of field at the bottom. And when you activate that, you can now again focus by selection, but it's fine the way it is. But I want to maybe just say it's the same point. You do have to pick a point. And what you get then is the focus plane, which is the plane that's going to be sharpest and most crisp. And you get a plane to the left and one way off out in front as well. They're going to be the trim planes that establish where this blur is going to start and stop. So from experimentation, I'm going to change this down. I'm not going to have focus by selection. I'm going to go down instead. D allows you to cycle up where this main crisp plane is going to be. So usually I put that plane that is going to be the most crisp focus point exactly or very close to where the actual focus of the camera will be. So I'm going to drag that back, and let's maybe leave it there. So I can see the plane in the center that is going to be the most in focus syncs up with the focal point of the camera, or the focus point of the camera. And then I don't really want the blur to happen too far back or too far forward, so really what I'm going to do is make those trim planes come pretty close together, a millimeter or 10 millimeters. Let's just say 10 millimeters or 11. So if you press the green tick, it brings you back to this view. And this is not going to do it justice. You usually have to get up here to render tools, preview window, and actually allow it to render to see the blur in the back. The blur takes a lot of processing power, so it does take a little while for the blur to kick in. And you can see there we have it. When it renders it to look a bit better, you can see even though this is a low res image, it's a lot sharper at the front here than it is at the back. So you can experiment around with the rest of those yourselves, but it's a very good way to get unique and kind of innovative and slightly different photorealistic images, especially if you're trying to do a cover page like this. There's another version of the cover page. It looks like that USB cable has been drawn very big. Not at all, it's drawn very small, but through that forced perspective you get this kind of different looking render. Here we can see a valve that I drew a couple of years ago. That's just a regular render, but by applying that forced perspective, you get a much more different one. And by applying a depth of field blur, you can see that the things in the very front towards the camera here are very crisp, very HD, and the blur kicks in as it goes backwards. And just a couple of examples here to show that it's worth experimenting with some of the settings. Depending on how far apart you put those trim planes, where you position the focal plane has an impact on the actual quality of the render you get. So here's one where I just have a small gap, 10mm between the trim planes, and I focused on this very front corner. And by just changing a couple of settings, so I'm coming in front of the corner a little bit, I've moved the focus forward, and I've narrowed the gap between the trim planes, you get a slightly different blur. Well, it's a significantly different blur, in fact. So just experiment with some of those settings and you can get all sorts of different blur effects. Experiment with the focal length and the angle of the camera. You can get much more creative and innovative, I suppose, forced perspectives as well.